This whole topic of fibromyalgia is a great big wastebasket. Like if you say, what is fibromyalgia? The way it's defined is that if you have a certain number of symptoms, then there is a diagnostic code for fibromyalgia. So it's pain in so many places and blah, blah, blah. And really, it doesn't really tell you anything of what is really wrong with you. So someone says, well, I've got fibromyalgia, but that's like saying I have a body or I have eyes. You know, it's not something that you can put your finger on. If someone says, I have strep throat, it's a very exact diagnosis. There is a cause, there is a solution, and there is a resolution of the condition. So you have a sore throat, and you go to the doctor, and the doctor does a swab, and he puts it in the solution, and it's a rapid strep test, and it says yes, you have strep, and he says, okay, you take penicillin, and then you know that in 3 or 4 days you're going to feel better, and by the end of 10 days it's going to be gone, and then you don't have that anymore, and then you go on with the rest of your life. So that would be a real diagnosis. The problem with fibromyalgia is none of those things are there. There is no known etiology, known thing that causes it. There is no accepted treatment, and there really isn't an accepted resolution of it. And most people just have it for a long, long time. And most of the regular medical viewpoint of it is that most of these people are women and they're menopausal and they're depressed and they should go see a counselor or be put on psych medication, and that's all they do, because what else would you do with someone like that? Usually the tests of the physical examination are not diagnostic. The CBC and the CMP and the regular testing is not diagnostic. So the doctor, if his viewpoint is very much that way, is left with something he can name it to get you out of his office, and maybe he writes you for some Valium or some Prozac or something like that, a muscle relaxant, and hopes that you won't come back, because he doesn't really know what to think of it or what to do or have a way to look at it that can resolve the problem. And so that's really a problem. And so when I sort of have grown up with this, that's the way I would have looked at something too. But then I went through this thing with my wife, and we had to get to the bottom of what is this autoimmune disease, which is another one of these big categories of what is wrong with her. Why are her thyroid tests high and her liver tests high? And why can't she lift her arm up anymore? And the 3 specialists that saw her, one was an endocrinologist, well, you have an autoimmune thyroiditis. And the other one was a hepatologist, and he said, well, it looks like your autoimmune disease is extended to your liver. And then when she couldn't lift up her arm, the neurologist said, well, you probably have an autoimmune disease of your nervous system, it's probably MS, and now we're going to give you some real medicines, and let's put you on steroids and interferon, and now we're going to really kill you. And so I knew enough at the time, which was the middle 90s, that I was an emergency room doctor, and I didn't know what was wrong with her or what to do about it, but I knew that that wasn't right. And so now our specialty in our clinic is looking at people who have chronic unsolved problems, where we actually look to find what are the things. This person was not born this way. This isn't a genetic condition. They had 20, 30, 50 years where they were normal, and then they weren't normal. And something happened in that period that made them not normal. And the question was, if you could find what are those things that weren't there before that are there now, maybe you could unwind this thing, and then they could go back to the way they were, or they could get better. And the other part of that thing is that maybe their body is missing things that should be there, but they're not eating it now, or they're not absorbing it now, or they're not digesting it now, and so when you measure those things, they're not there. And if the body is a machine, it's a biochemical machine, and you don't have enough selenium or vitamin A or vitamin D or essential amino acid or essential fat, well, that machine just isn't going to work quite right. And then if you have this other category, which is there's things in their body that shouldn't be there, then the body has trouble getting rid of those things. And generally the things that shouldn't be there are toxins and infections. And the environment is full of those things. Now, I think the thing to appreciate, really, is that if you look at someone's body, the health is determined, really, on the level of every cell in the body. So if we took a skin cell and biopsied it, you could put it in a dish, and if the culture media was right, the cell would grow. You could take a liver cell, a brain cell, a heart cell, a nerve cell, and these things can be grown in tissue culture. They're independent living units, organisms. And they're very busy. An average cell, so it has to take in nutrients, it has to get rid of waste, it has to make its own proteins, it has to make its own energy. And it does it at the rate of approximately 2,000 times per second. Every cell in your body. And your health depends on your cells being healthy. Now, if you counted up all the cells in your body that make up your skin and your nervous system and your heart and your organs, it's about 100, that's 1,000, that's million, that's billion, and that's trillion. About 100 trillion cells in an average person's body. 100 trillion cells with reaction rates of 2,000 times per second. Now go to your best computer mind in the world and say, I have a problem. I've got a cell that reacts at 2,000 times per second, and I've got 100 trillion of them. I need a program that's going to keep this whole thing organized. Because in our body, every cell knows at every second what it's supposed to be doing. And you could be at the top of Mount Everest. 2 weeks ago I was in the Dead Sea, so it's the lowest point on Earth. The conditions are very different there. And it works when you're sleeping, it works when you're running, it works when it's cold, it works when it's hot. It's an impossible thing that you could organize this stuff with any computer known. It's impossible. It'd probably take a room this big, but it still wouldn't even work. And it's responsive to things like thought, because you're not your body. You're a spiritual unit which can think, that's aware. You're not your brain, okay? I have a patient now that's got just a little piece of brain left. When he was a baby, he had a stroke. And when we did an MRI, the whole inside of his brain is water, and there's a little bit of brain, and he runs a business, and he's very successful, and he's got almost nothing up there. Okay? So, you're not those things, but you have a thought of, I'm going to lift my arm up. And it lifts up somehow. Try to figure that out. The energy that's created in the thought is making a reaction on a nerve structure, and that nerve structure is firing, and then the thing reacts. So what about all the stuff that's going on? 99.99% of what goes on in the body, you don't even have to worry about. Your heart beats, your salt level's okay, your estrogen level's okay, or it's not, or these things are all going on, and when the body is working well, this operating system that's in our body, it's some kind of operating system. Nobody understands this. There's no model for this. There just is nobody, this is impossible. And if you think that this was an accident of biology over the last million years, try to get a structure this complicated from trial and error. This is a created thing somehow. And it's very complicated. And for most people, for most of the time, it works pretty darn well. And if you took this kind of structure and you put it in an environment like this, where the food isn't very good, and the environment is very toxic, you can get these things going into the body and into the cells, and then they start to have trouble. They get poisoned. They get infected. And then this operating system, which has to have all this communication all the time to work right, doesn't work right. So the person now has high blood pressure, or the person has high cholesterol, or the person has low thyroid. These are all complex things that have to be coordinated by this central operating system. And it's kind of like a computer. You get a virus in the computer, and it blocks the communication within the computer, or it gives the computer wrong instructions, and you go to push send, and the little thing goes around and around and around and around. It's like... And then if you can get somebody who knows about this stuff, and they have a program where they can identify that virus or that malware or spyware, whatever it is, and they can get it isolated, or they can get it pulled apart, then the thing goes back on. And so when we're looking at someone with fibromyalgia, that's what's wrong with them. They have viruses and bacteria and poisons and toxins within their system that has messed with their operating system, and it doesn't work now. And their symptom in fibromyalgia is probably pain and fatigue, and they can't think straight, and they probably don't sleep very well, and they just don't feel like themselves. And this is not a psychological disease. They're not crazy. I saw a new one today, and she about cried. And when I said, so I was talking to her, and I heard her whole story, which is just a very typical story. She was fine until 4 or 5 years ago, and then she wasn't fine, and she went downhill, and I'm the 14th doctor. And the doctors did all the tests, and you're fine. And she was put on 6 or 7 different kinds of psychological medicines. And she says, I knew that wasn't wrong with me. But then the family starts looking at it, and her husband actually told me tonight that he said, I didn't sign up for this, and he divorced her for 5 years. And then for some reason, he realized that she was the love of his life, and he came back, and now they're back together again. And he was there in the office with her, and he says that she's the love of my life. And I showed her, I took a drop of her blood, and I put it on the microscope, and I showed her what her blood looked like. And her blood looked terrible. It looked very terrible. And we saw organisms swimming around in her blood, microorganisms. You can see them if you have the right kind of microscope. And here are her blood cells, and instead of being all separate and nice, they're all glommed up. And then in the background, we saw 3 different parasitic type organisms swimming around in her bloodstream. And the other thing that we saw is something called biofilm. It's a whole collection of proteins and mucus that surround colonies of organisms that are actually living in the person's blood. And I have a normal picture over here, and then on the screen is projected this other thing of what her blood looked like. And I said, well, here's what normal looks like, and here's what you look like. And this certifies for sure that you're not crazy. You have an actual physical illness because your blood looks bad. And this isn't something that you could dream up by yourself because you were depressed. And she started to cry. Because she said, you're the first person who ever told me. Because I started to doubt myself too. And my family doubted me, and my doctors all doubted me. But they were all wrong. The person has something. So if they come to the realization that what's wrong with you is actually something that could be discovered, and then if those things are discovered and you work out those things to get them off, then the person starts to feel better and they get their life back. And then they feel good. Now, if we look at this and we reduce this to the most basic thing, am I making sense?
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So if we look at this cell as a representation of the rest of the cells in your body, depending on the toxin or depending on the infection, there may be sets of cells that are affected and there may be sets that aren't. Your liver and kidney might be working fine, but your nervous system might not be working fine. Or your heart might not be working fine. Or it's a whole collection of things. But if we reduce it to the cell, a healthy body has healthy cells. And if we look at the cells, the thing that the cell has to be able to do to live and do its job is it has to make energy. And in sick people, it doesn't matter what's wrong with you. There is an energy crisis in the body. The cell can't make enough energy. Now, if your brain doesn't make enough energy, it might be that you can't sleep or you're anxious or you're depressed. If your heart can't make energy, you might have heart failure or you might have arrhythmias. You know, your heartbeat's not beating correctly. If your liver doesn't make energy, you may not be able to detoxify. You may not be able to make the correct proteins. If your kidney, same thing. And some people are affected more by a toxin or an infection in one area versus another area. But the bottom line on what's wrong in all these things is that this cell can't make enough energy so that it can do its job and live. And the way the cell makes energy is it has to take in oxygen and it has to take in food. So proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. And those things go to these little things in the cell, which are called mitochondria. And in the mitochondria, there are chemical reactions that take place that allow this cell to make an energy particle, which is called ATP. Now, these mitochondria used to be bacteria. A few million years ago, this was an independent cell, and this was an independent bacteria. And somehow they got together in a cooperative relationship, and the cell said, if you come inside me and make energy for me, I'll supply you with heat, light, power, comfort, and all you have to do is make energy, and I'll supply you with all the materials that you need. Okay? There's another impossibility, but this is what happened. And they got together. And in every one of our cells now, in our body, there are 1,000 to 2,000 mitochondria per cell. 10% of our body weight is actually mitochondria. Now, in some areas of the body where there's really massive energy needs, like in the heart and in the brain, there may be 10,000 of these things per cell. In the egg cell, in the ovary, because that cell has to be the starting point for a whole body, so that egg cell gets fertilized. That egg cell has 100,000 mitochondria in it. Because it has massive energy needs. Because you're going to take one cell and you're going to end up with 100 trillion. But the average cell has 1,000 to 2,000. And if those are working correctly, it can make enough energy. 38 ATPs every time the oxygen comes in. Now, there are a lot of things that can mess this up. If a person's thyroid is low, The thyroid is responsible for how many of these are in each cell and how active they are. So if we did a biopsy of someone who had low thyroid, we might only find 500 mitochondria per cell instead of 2,000. Now, why are they tired? Why is their skin dry? Why are they constipated? Why can't they think? Why are they gaining weight? Well, their thyroid hasn't got enough mitochondria going in each cell, and this cell can't do it. And you give that person thyroid and get the level up, and within a few weeks the cells start growing more mitochondria, and you rebiopsy them a month later, and now they got 1,000 or 2,000 per cell, and now that person says, hey, my waist is getting better, and I'm now warm because I've been cold for a long time, and I can think faster, and my body's not working, and that might be one of the reasons why this person feels that way. Okay? Now it might be that this person is got Lyme disease, or mycoplasma, or they got a vaccine, or they got they have a bad intestine and they aren't absorbing their nutrients, which affect the ability of these mitochondria to work. And then they don't work. You might have enough, it might not be a thyroid problem, but they go too slow. They just can't quite do it.
They're not getting enough fuel because of some other problem somewhere else.
Yeah. Sometimes it's blood supply. Sometimes there's toxins within the structure of the mitochondria that block the chemical reactions. Because this is a chemical factory. It's generating these things by breaking down sugar and collecting the little electrons into something that it can hold as like a battery that it can then produce energy with. We know that 100% of pharmaceutical drugs poison mitochondria. Okay? If you're on a drug, your mitochondria are poisoned. Which is a problem with drugs. It's a problem with pesticides. It's a problem with herbicides. It's a problem with dyes and chemicals. It's a problem with, like, we're in an environment where there's 80,000 chemicals that have been added to our environment that weren't there 100 years ago. They're in skin products and hair products and in foods. You know, if you go to a regular store and you look at the side of a box of Triscuits, who knows what it is? The body has no idea what all this stuff is. It's all chemicals. You know, you give the body a peach or a chicken leg or a pork chop. It's like, oh, I know what that is. For 2.5 million years, my people have been, oh, we know what to do with that. It goes in, we know how to process it, we know what to do with it. What do you do with bisphenol A, and what do you do with yellow dye number 4? Body has no idea what to do with it. Sometimes it can't even detoxify. It's like, I don't know, put it over here. You know, one of the theories of massive obesity in some people is they just need more storage for their toxins because the body hasn't figured out how to even get rid of it. And if you add more space, you go, okay, we can put some over here, and let's put some over here, and put some over here, because if we keep it out of the main things, keep it out of the brain, or out of the heart, or out of the liver, they can keep going, and the body can operate. The body's just, these cells are all in some sort of a survival mode, and they do whatever they can to try to just keep surviving in any way they can. And sometimes they do funky things, and that is something that sometimes happens with some people. And if you figure out what's wrong with those people, sometimes the biggest problem you have is there's so much toxin in their body that to get them through that process where as they lose fat, the toxins just pour out. So how can you get rid of it in time so that they don't feel actually sicker from what you're doing? One of the main things that happens with this, when these aren't working, is that the cell, in order to survive, is going to go to an alternative way to make energy. Now we call this, because it's oxygen, we call this aerobic. Aerobic means air. That using oxygen to make energy is the preferred method, and you get 38 of these ATP every time it goes around. If there is block in the biochemistry within the cell, in order to get the energy made, the cell will start using energy in an alternative way. And that is called An means not. Aerobic. It's not using oxygen to make energy because it can't use these things to make energy. It's got another way to do it. It's called fermentation. And the problem with fermentation is that if you do anaerobic energy manufacturing, you only get 2 ATP for every go-around. Now, if you have muscles and they are operating on anaerobic metabolism, you are going to hurt. See, when you make aerobic metabolism, does anybody know what the waste product is for aerobic metabolism? There's 2 main waste products.
It's toxic.
No. When this is burning this way,
Okay.
there's 2 things that after this aerobic reaction occurs, there's 2 things left over.
Carbon dioxide?
Carbon dioxide is 1. And what happens with that? We breathe it out. That's why we breathe. That's why we breathe. We breathe in oxygen. It goes to the cells. They make energy. The waste product is CO2. And the CO2 jumps out in the red blood cells. It goes back to your lung. You breathe out. And you get rid of the CO2. Okay? What happens if you don't breathe for 5 minutes? Guess what stops? Your mitochondria stop. You know, you can live for probably, I don't know, weeks without eating. Okay? Maybe months. You can live weeks without water. You can live, I don't know, 5 minutes, 7 minutes without air. How long can you live without ATP? None. So you've got to have this stuff. And so the waste product is carbon dioxide and water. We pee out the water or sweat out the water, and the carbon dioxide we breathe off, and it's a very clean cycle. When you've got anaerobic metabolism, does anybody know what the waste products are? Lactic acid. For every molecule of ATP that's made, you get 36 units of lactic acid.
Isn't anaerobic lifting weights?
Well, you can do an activity that, everyone has a certain capacity to use oxygen when they exercise. So if you're running along and you're cruising and you're able to talk to someone, you're exercising at a rate where the cells can get enough energy using aerobic metabolism to do it. But if you start sprinting, within maybe 20, 30, 40 seconds, you are demanding more than the cell can deliver with oxygen, and it's going to go anaerobic. And why do you stop after 30 seconds or a minute when you're doing a 100-yard dash? It's because you're making so much lactic acid that then cause pain and shortness of breath, and you can't breathe because you exceeded the limits of what the cell could make as energy.
Is that the same?
And that's happening in someone with fibromyalgia when they're sitting, not when they're running. We have a test that we do on people to measure how well is this system working. And when the person says, it takes all the effort I can muster for me to sit up in bed and maybe make it to the bathroom, most of their body is in anaerobic metabolism. And they couldn't do more if you had prodding them with a stick. They're already at the limits that you would be at if you felt relatively well, and you would just run around the block as fast as you could. And now they said, okay, now run around the block again or walk 20 more feet. And it'd be like, I can't do that. I can't do it. And they're right, they can't do it. They don't have enough ATP to supply the fuel to even do it. And they're really in bad shape. Their mitochondria are really, really toxic and infected, And the only way they're gonna get better is they have to be rehabilitated. Yeah.
What's ATP?
ATP is the name of a chemical called adenosine triphosphate. It's a molecule where the body can store energy in it. It's a chemical, it's like a chemical battery store. And when the body needs energy, it's a molecule that's got 3 phosphates on it. And when the body needs energy, when it pulls off a phosphate, it releases energy. Then the cell can take that energy and do something with it. And there's 3 of them, so it can pull off 1, 2, 3, and then it's done, and then it has to be remade. And this process of aerobic metabolism is being able to store energy as it puts one phosphate on, another phosphate on, another phosphate on, and then it's like charged up. So when we end up at anaerobic, now we've got lactic acid, and you can eat all the alkaline diet you want. If you're almost all of the acidity in a body, you measure your morning pH in your saliva and it's 5, and you measure your urine pH and it's 5, your body is very acidic. That is coming from this metabolism. That's where it's coming from. And you can eat you can do a juice fast if you want to. It is not going to fix this. It's not going to make you alkaline, because the problem is in the metabolism of the cells in the body. And someone whose body is working well could eat a diet that you'd say to a vegetarian, holy cow, you're eating an acidic diet. I sure am. I had a big salad and I had a piece of meat, or I had a piece of fish, and there's acid stuff and all that stuff. But if your metabolism is working right, you're not acidic at all. Because that isn't what the problem is. The problem is in the metabolism. And so what we have to figure out with people who have fibromyalgia is, what are the toxins and what are the infections that have caused this thing to behave this way, that 1 year ago or 5 years ago wasn't behaving that way. And if we can figure out what those things are and get that handled, these cells aren't dead. They will grow new mitochondria, because these mitochondria can replicate themselves. Remember, they're bacteria. They can make more of them in the cell. They have their own DNA. They can replicate. They can make more. They can regrow. If you go on a fitness program, and let's say you can barely run around the block, and then you do the fitness program, and now you can run around the block and you can do another half a block. What happened? Your cells adapted and they made more mitochondria. And so now you can process more oxygen and process more fuel, and you can make more ATP, and now you're fitter. And the guys who are like at the elite end of athletics have a genetic ability to either have a lot of mitochondria per cell, or their mitochondria are very efficient, and they can make energy like mad. And they make very little lactic acid. When they took Lance Armstrong and they tested him to see, could they get him in an anaerobic state, so that they got to the end of his limits, they had trouble even doing it. Like his body could handle huge amounts of oxygen to make fuel and barely made any lactic acid. And the top tier of athletes, that's what that's what you see in them. Like an average person, you can measure, and this is something that we actually measure in the clinic. We lay you on the table and we put a mask on you, and we measure how much oxygen is your body using per minute, and how much carbon dioxide are you breathing out per minute. And we can find out, where are you on this scale? And like I said, if you're really sick, you are taking in oxygen and you aren't making CO2. The guy in the 20 minutes that you lay on the table and you breathe the oxygen, you might have breathed in 25 liters of oxygen per minute. And the amount of carbon dioxide that comes out is like 1. It ought to be equal. Every molecule of oxygen that comes in, the carbon dioxide is made, because it went around aerobically and that got made. And someone who's really sick comes in, they breathe in 25 of oxygen, and they get 1 molecule or 2 molecules of CO2, and they get a lot of lactic acid, and they can't move. They have no endurance. They get tired too fast. They can't make it. It's a biochemical problem. Now, one of the things that we're looking for in this is okay, what are the toxins that are doing it? The heavy metals and the chemicals and the pesticides. So we have a test which we look Like, what are you peeing out right now? What is your body trying to get rid of? Plastics, styrofoams, chemicals, pesticides, gasoline additives. I had a little girl a couple years ago. She was 12 years old, and she had kind of dropped out of school 9 months before. She was exhausted. She was in bed. She couldn't study. They had no idea what was wrong with her. She went to the University of Florida. She was seen by their pediatricians, and they had no answers. And nobody had any answers. And her regular blood tests were normal, and of course they thought she was pre-pubertal and her hormones were off, and let's give her some antidepressants and all this stuff, and nothing made any difference with her. And when she came down, we did this test on her. One of the things that we did on her was we collected urine and we measured 25 different environmental toxins. And all of them were fine, except for a chemical, which is called MTBE. It's a gasoline additive. The companies add it to gasoline to make the octane rating higher. And the normal level is probably around up to 200. And hers was 39,000. The lab called because they said, we've never seen this before. And so when I went back when the patient came back for the follow-up to see what to go through the testing, and the rest of her things were okay. The pesticides and the plastics and the chemicals and the dyes and the other thing that this test measures was okay. So I said, is she sniffing gasoline? Is she bathing in gasoline? What is she doing with gasoline? And they said, oh my God. She had decided 2 years before that she was going to be the next Danica Patrick. Danica Patrick is the NASCAR driver that's the female. I don't know if she's the only one, but she's the one that she's done really well. And so we have been giving her every weekend, she's on a track, in a car, 2 to 3 hours a day, in a midget race car, learning how to drive, learning how to become a race car driver. And she was inhaling those fumes, and her body had a problem detoxifying those fumes, and that had caused her brain problem. And when we detoxified her brain came back, and she became a nice, normal 12-year-old girl. Okay? Now, she didn't present as fibromyalgia, but fibromyalgia is just how that does that in some people. So there was an answer. It's like, okay, there's a problem. Here's an answer. Handle the problem. Then the patient gets better. Had another one that came up on this. This woman is in her early 50s. She's a teacher. She's one of the best female marathon runners in the county. And she came in with a story of chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia, and she didn't know what was wrong with her, and she couldn't run anymore. And on that same test, what came up was a fumigant that her levels were very, very high. And the rest of her things really looked pretty good. And I had no idea where she was getting this. And I said, you're a teacher and you're smart, and I'm going to give you homework, and you got to go figure out where did you get this stuff from. Because your pesticides aren't high, and your gasoline additives aren't high, and your plastics and your styrofoams aren't high. And she came back the next visit, and she said, I figured out where I got this. She said, my go-to snack is raw almonds. Non-organic raw almonds. Now, you can't sell raw almonds in Florida unless they're radiated or they're fumigated. And she was eating 2 cups of raw almonds every day, non-organic. If they're organic, they don't do the fumigant. But she was eating non-organic, 2 cups a day of raw almonds for years. And that was the source of this high level of perchlorate that was in her body. So we had an answer. And we detoxified her from her perchlorate, and she's running again. Okay? So these things are tricky only if you're not curious enough as a physician to what is wrong with this person? There is something wrong that is discoverable. That's like the first step of let's find out. And it requires a lot of testing and a lot of looking. But generally we come up with lots of stuff in people. then as we debug what those things are, we can find out these things, and then they come back and they say, yeah, it's better, and then we can help them. Yeah.
Is radon, could that affect people?
Yeah, sure.
In the same,
Some toxic waste sites have radon in them.
in some houses, with a stone
That's
foundation
right.
from New England.
That's right. It's a radioactive chemical. Radioactive chemicals are harmful to the body. The trick now is that there's, like I said, there's like 80,000 chemicals. None of these have been tested for safety, and none of them have been tested when, if you take a 100 rats, and you figure out how much lead do you have to give those rats so that 50% of them die. In toxicology, it's called the LD50, lethal dose 50. So you give 100 rats this amount, half of them will die from the lead, okay? LD50 of lead. Then you take another group of rats and you say, okay, how much mercury do we have to give them so that 50% of them die? And we find that, okay, 1 part mercury will kill 50% of the rats, and 1 part lead will kill 50% of the rats. How many percent of the rats will die if we give them 1 part mercury and 1 part lead? 99% of the rats will die. It isn't 1 plus 1. It's 1 times 10 or 20 or 50. Now, it's an impossibility to figure out. Our exposures are extraordinary. All of us, even as clean as you want to be, you're getting this stuff. What are the interactions? What are the rates of the interactions? Who knows? There's no idea. If you minimalize as much as you can. So yes, I'm eating organic food. Yes, I'm eating reverse osmosis water. And yes, I'm watching the chemicals that I'm putting on my body. And yes, I'm taking care of my indoor environment, and there isn't mold and there isn't this other stuff in there. You have maybe a fighting chance. When I was working in the emergency room, we had a lot of the people that came in were people who were in nursing homes. And you would get an 82-year-old person who came in on a stretcher, who was semi-conscious, and they were moaning about their belly, and they were on 12 prescription medicines. And in the emergency room, we were like, oh, okay, what do we do with her? How do we figure this out? And one of the most successful, and we had a computer in the emergency room, which was designed to figure out interactions between medication, because she's on 12 prescription drugs. She's on something for sleep, and something for arthritis, and something for cholesterol, and something for her diabetes, and something for her depression, and something for her blood pressure. It's all the usual things, and something for pain. And so we would plug in the computer, list all the medicines she's on, and then the computer would do a sort out of all the side effects of all the medicines, and then it would give you it's this. Well, in the computer, if you've ever looked in the physician's test reference under any one drug, there's usually many columns of potential problems with that drug. And in the computer, if you plugged in 3 or more drugs, the computer would go tilt. I don't know. Who could know? So, okay. So with the interactions that are occurring with all this stuff, with us, it's hard to know. But usually, about 85% of the time, we can figure out, okay, there's these infections, there's this, there's this, there's this. At least we can test for this stuff. We can figure it out. And usually we can move this along. And the pain, if they're talking about fibromyalgia, it starts to go away. Because the mitochondria turn back on, and they start to get better. Now, the end stage, do you know what the end stage is of when a mitochondria ought to die because it's so toxic, but it doesn't die? You know what that is, what we call that? It's the big C. See, cancer is a cell that's operating on anaerobic metabolism only. And it's supposed to die. And it figures out a way to survive. So on this path from peak fitness, where you have an ability to use oxygen and make energy, is on the one end. And in the middle is various sufferings that people go through And on this end is cancer. Because cancer is anaerobic metabolism. And if that anaerobic metabolism is hitting the breast, or the prostate, or the brain, or the kidney, or the liver, and those cells don't, they're supposed to kill themselves, and they don't, they start to become funky, or they don't behave right. And so the idea is that if we can get people, I had somebody today, it was the last patient I saw today. She's not sick. She was having some menopausal symptoms. And I wrote her a program. I wrote her for some lab work, and I wrote her a program. And I did some energetic testing on her. It looked to me like her intestine needed some help. And she was acting like her body was autoimmune. It was reacting against itself. And she had a history of some teeth that were root canaled, and sometimes these are a problem. And so I gave her a whole bunch of instructions. I said, go to the dentist and get a special kind of x-ray to make sure you don't have any infected teeth, any abscessed teeth. And I said, you should take these supplements for your intestine, because I'm testing that you got a parasite in there, and you got some bad bacteria in there, and you got a leaky gut, and let's get you going on this program. And I want you to go in our, hi, that's my boss. She just flew in from California, hi. And I said, I want you to go in the IV room because I want to give you some IV B vitamins and calcium and magnesium, and I want to give you some ozone, which is oxygen, because I know we can get your system detoxified and we can get you feeling better. And she didn't do anything. She did the lab testing, and she said, I don't feel sick, so I don't think I should do the program. So I saw her back today. I saw her like 6 weeks ago. So she came back today to get her labs looked at. And she had a tapeworm, and she had 2 bad bacteria, and she had a leaky gut, and she had a selenium, and a magnesium, and a potassium, really severe deficiency. And she was having, her body was having trouble making proteins. And she said, well, I don't feel any of it. And I said, it's really good that you don't feel any of it. You were really smart to come in here. Because in 5 years, 8 years, you are gonna have something. You know, the average breast cancer started 8 to 10 years before there's a lump. What happened to it? This is what happened to it. Those cells were poisoned, and they went funny, and then they went funnier, and then they went funnier, and it's 1 cell, and then 3 months later it's 2 cells, and 3 months later it's 8 cells, and 8 years later it's 1 trillion cells, and a grape-sized lump is 1 trillion cells. And now, you know, now it's real trouble. But if you get it on the front end, well, yes, let's handle the parasite. Let's handle your leaky gut. Let's handle your autoimmune. Let's handle your potassium, your magnesium, and your selenium deficiency. And please go to the dentist and let's get that x-ray and see, do you have an abscessed tooth? And let's handle this now, because you could save a world of hurt later if you handle it now. And then you don't have to go through this whole thing with drastic measures later. Okay? So does this make sense to you? Okay. So so that's the idea. I have a couple. I have 9 minutes, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer. Yeah.
This is a little change of subject, but what do you think about the blood type diet?
I think that there's no scientific validity to it. People, about 50% or a little more of people have O-type blood. And the O-type blood is pretty much a paleo-type diet. And so those people do really well because they get off grains and they get off dairy and they get off citrus fruits and they feel really good. So, so I think we put, you know, everybody isn't the same. But that idea for most people of our ancestors, for, you know, if you look at human beings, at our body types, they go back about a little over 2 million years. You know, the earliest fossils go back about 2 million years, and they were upright primates like us. And they were hunter-gatherers, okay? And they roamed around and they ate what they could get. And what they could get in those days was different kinds of plants, nuts and seeds, meat, fish, maybe eggs sometimes. That's what they could get. They weren't farming, they weren't eating grains, they weren't eating dairy, they hadn't domesticated animals. And that period lasts from about 2 million years ago to about 10,000 years ago. So 99.94% of our genetic history that's what our people ate. Farming was introduced about 10,000 years ago, and domesticating animals to get dairy products was introduced about the same time. So in terms of our biological age, it's like a fraction of the time. And so most people do well if they eat those foods. And of course, as organic as you can get. And we try people on that. Now sometimes people can have some other foods, and we work out things that you prefer stuff. We find that vegetarianism is really rough on almost everybody's body. It just isn't enough protein. And it's not healthier. It doesn't mean you're going to get less cancer. It doesn't cure cancer. It doesn't do any of these things. Most people who are on a pure vegetarian diet, or even worse on a vegan diet, their bodies are not doing well. And within a couple of years of it, you can measure it. Their serum proteins are too low, their hormones are too low, they don't really feel good. And the problem is it becomes a religion for a lot of people, like I'm a this and I'm gonna do it, but they don't really feel well. I got so many yoga teachers who were vegans and they come in because they're exhausted and they don't feel good, and it's like, you can't eat this way, this is not nourishing your body. And sometimes we can figure out a way to do it, if it's a spiritual thing where they don't wanna have animals or things like that, sometimes we can work around it. But generally, for your average person, it just doesn't really work.
I forget the difference between vegan and vegetarian
Vegan is no animal anything.
at all.
No honey or any of this.
Anything animal. It's
No
vegetables,
animal
really.
products.
Fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds, that's it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you still promote
What do you-
paleo? Is that your?
Most people paleo, some people we do a ketogenic, like on the cancer people, we do ketogenic. Some people with bad neurological disease, we do a ketogenic, which is real high fat, real low carb.
What are your thoughts on intermittent fasting and fasting in general?
I think it's very good, and for most people, it's really good. If you take a day off a week and you don't eat, or you eat within a 6, 8, maybe even 10-hour window, that the body works better. Our ancestors didn't. We just have so much abundance now of food that the body is. It's like that isn't how it was. For most of the time, people barely had enough to eat, and they were lean, and they were able to use their own fat. And when they ate, they might eat a lot, but then they might not eat for a day or 2 or 3, and that the body seems to do better with that.
We haven't evolved, though, even over 10,000.
It's too short. It's too short. Like 2.5 million to now
Yeah, but
versus 10,000. So
each
it's
child that we have, I know it takes a while to have one, but
it's funny for those of you, the experimenter's name was Pottinger, and he was experimenting with diets and natural, like people eating their natural food diets versus people eating artificial diets. And so they did the experiment with cats. Now cats' normal food is raw meat. So what he did was he took kittens, and he started feeding kittens processed cat food. This is back in the 20s, so it was not nearly as bad as it is now, or maybe 30s. He found that within 4 generations, the arch of the palate went narrow. Now these cats needed orthodontics, and they needed to have their premolars pulled because there was no room in their teeth. And they started getting itchy, and they started having funny stuff, and their litters got funny, and they started losing pregnancies. Just in 4 generations of wrong stuff. Now we're tipping the edge right now, because this really went south probably about 60, 80 years ago. I remember growing up in the 50s that it was way better than it is now. Now it's really off the deep end. And I was just at a lecture, and some of you may have heard of Zach Bush. He's got a product called Restore, and he's a super smart guy. He's one of the leaders in this field. And he said that something like 70 or 80% of all the living species, both fauna foul. You know, I mean, fauna and or the other thing is.
Flora.
Flora and fauna have disappeared from planet Earth in the last 100 years. And that we are about 60 generations away from extinction.
Whoa.
Because the soil is so toxic, and the food is so toxic, and the humans are so toxic, that the whole thing is this is just gonna be like he said there's like, I don't remember how many species have disappeared. They're like the dinosaurs. Like there was a catastrophic event and they're gone. But we're doing ourselves in right now. And that there is time to turn it around, but it's gotta be pretty soon that we turn it around. Because if you just look at, when I used to be a pediatrician, and I remember, this was 1978, we're at University Hospital in San Diego, and we're making rounds with the chairman of the department. And we come across a kid, and he's in a crib, and the crib has a thing on it so the kid can't crawl out. He's 14 months old. And he said, when we're done with rounds today, you guys go in and examine that kid, because you'll never see another one in your life, but in case you do, you'll know what it is. This kid has autism.
Oh, my word.
Now, he said that the incidence of autism at that time was 1 in 150,000 births. He said a busy pediatrician working for 40 years will not see that many kids in his lifetime. So you'll probably never see another one. Do you know what the incidence of autism is now? It's 1 in 37 children. Okay? From 1 in 150,000 to 1 in 37. Now, if you go in the school system, when I was growing up in school, there wasn't more kids in special ed and special tutoring and special this and special that than there were the regular guys. Now, it's upside down. And you take this a couple more generations, and who's going to work? So this is really a crisis. It's really a catastrophe. And each person in their own has to just take it upon themselves and their family that if we're going to get out of here and we're going to have future generations, and we're going to have a planet, we got to get going. Because the guys who are running things for the sake of power and money are running this place, and they own this place. And these companies that are making you know that there's 5 billion tons of glyphosate put on the planet every year, and it's probably responsible for this whole thing, because not only does it kill your gut, make you have a leaky gut, but it's killing the microorganisms in the soil, which we are all dependent on, because if those microorganisms don't break down into minerals and allow plants to absorb things, there's going to be no food. So you vote with your dollar and you vote with your mouth. And if you don't patronize them, they're going to change. Why did Amazon buy Whole Foods? Because it makes money. Not that they're such a great example of everything, but at least it's better than, what the other guys are doing. Last one.
I have a quick question about the cells. So when people go for a walk and then they get all swelled up, is that the body?
Couldn't handle it.
Okay.
Couldn't handle it.
So it's going right into anaerobic like right away.
It on some level, yes.
And that's probably caused from some sort of toxin that's blocking.
Right.
Okay.
Okay, one.
Okay, thank you. Stem cell therapy.
So stem cells can if you put stem cells into this mess, you're wasting your money. Because they're gonna get toxic just like everybody else. The ideal way to do stem cells is clean it all up first. Clean it up as well as you can. Metals, chemicals, pesticides, get as optimum function as you can. Then stem cells may be a way to either get your own tissue to start going, or sometimes the stem cells will take in you and they'll get things going, but they can do it in an environment where they can actually survive and thrive. Okay. What? I think she said so. So fill out those forms, please. Give me a good grade if you like this. And if you want to inquire about seeing us at the clinic, talk to Michelle.
Courtney.
Huh?
Courtney.
And Courtney. Courtney's brand new, so I haven't memorized her name yet.
I'll get there.
And thanks for your kind attention.
Thank you.